IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashdin, Doctor, your habit coach, and today with us for the second time, we have Brian Bogert. And today we're going to be talking about rock bottom. And as you know, on our Habit Coach podcast, we've been covering this concept where we feel that we should be celebrating our rock bottom moments because these are the times when we grow. These are the times that give us that foundation to kick off from, to be whatever we can be, to grow and expand our lives. So I'm very excited to have this discussion because this is something that Brian talks about a lot as well. So Brian, super excited to have you on for a second time.
Man, I'm excited to be here. I've enjoyed our first conversation. I know this one's going to be fire just like the last one.
Absolutely. So Brian, when I talk about rock bottoms, right, what does rock bottom mean to you?
Yeah. Rock bottom is literally that. Like you are at the bottom, you're being ground into the earth. It feels like there's no chance or ability for you to stand up. And I understand these moments intimately. I've had a number of them in my life. Mm-hmm. I want to share the very first one with you. I want everybody to close their eyes for just a second. I'll tell you when to reopen them. I want you to imagine walking out of a shopping store after a great shopping trip, heading back to your car, turning your head in the parking lot and seeing a truck barreling 40 miles an hour right at you with no time to react. You can open your eyes now. That's where this portion of this story begins. My mom, my brother, and I had gone to our local Walmart to get a 1-inch paintbrush. And as we were headed back to the car, I've always had an excitement, vigor for life, a lot of energy. And so it wasn't a surprise to anybody that I was the first one to the car. Well, I got there first, waited for my mom and brother to catch up to unlock the doors. You see, this was before we had key fobs, right? We had to put the good old school key in the door and turn it. And, as I'm standing there waiting, a truck pulls up in front of the store. Driver and middle passenger get out. Mm-hmm. And the passenger all the way to the right feels the truck moving backwards. So he did what any one of us would do. He moves over to put his foot on the brake, but he instead hit the gas. Combination of shock and force threw him up onto the steering wheel, up onto the dashboard. And before you know it, he's catapulting 40 miles an hour across the parking lot right at us with no time to react.
God.
Now, we're in an end spot. So he went up and over the end spot, went up and over the tree in the end spot, hit our car, knocked me over, ran over me diagonally, tore my spleen, left a tire track scar on my stomach, and continued on to completely sever my left arm from my body.
Wow.
So there I am. I'm laying in the parking lot on a 115-degree day in Phoenix, Arizona. My mom and brother just watched the entire thing. My arm is 10 feet away from me. And my guardian angel also happened to see this all happen. You see, a nurse walked out of the store and literally saw the life and limb scenario right in front of her. She rushed over and immediately stopped the bleeding on the main wound and instructed some innocent bystanders to run inside, grab a cooler, fill it with ice, and have my arm on ice within minutes. Had she not done one or either of those things, I'd either not be here with you today or I'd be here with you today with a cleaned up stump and no arm. Okay. That's how important she was in my process of recovery. And so, the reality of it is I'm gonna expedite this story. I'm sure a lot of the listeners weren't expecting it to go there today, right? With this idea of rock bottom moments. And what I've realized in all this time though, is that we all have unique stories. We all hit rock bottom at one point in our life or multiple times in our lives. I know I have multiple times. But what I've learned in all my time of doing this is that what's important is that we pause and become aware of the lessons we can extract from our stories, and then become intentional with how do we apply them in our lives. And we all have the ability to do that. And we all have the ability to tap into the collective wisdom of other people's stories and the lessons that they've extracted to shorten our curve to learning. So I'll share with you two primary lessons that I extracted from this. There have been many, many others over the years, but these are two that have really guided my life. One, I learned not to get stuck by what had happened to me, but instead get moved by what I could do with it.
Nice.
And the second, I didn't realize until far later. You see, as a 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old, I experienced a lot of those post-accident years in a fog, right? I mean, I went to relentless surgeries, years of therapy, 3 days a week, early before school, crazy amounts of like pain and scar tissue and muscle stem work on my arms and hands and stretching for years, right? But I was a part of it and went along with it. And although I was very aware of the situation I was in, I didn't have the same level of awareness that my parents did. You see, they weren't in a fog. And they looked at it and realized that the idea of their son growing up without the use of his arm was a source of great suffering for them. And so they willed themselves day in and day out to do what was necessary, what was ultimately going to heal me They embraced the pain that was necessary to do what would strengthen me. And so whether it was intentional or not, what they did was they ingrained in me a philosophy and a way of living. You see, I learned to embrace pain to avoid suffering. And I believe when that's done correctly, you also gain freedom. And this is the same concept that I used to not only overcome this unique injury, but how my business partners and I in our last business built our business from $250,000 to over 15 million in revenue within the span of a decade. And how now I've flipped that on its head as a human behavior and performance coach to help hundreds of individuals and organizations just like you, just like our listeners, become more aware, more intentional, and more of who they already are. Because I see when that happens, and we talked about this on our last show together, right? When that happens, the door begins to crack to perspective, motivation, and direction. And that is what allows joy, freedom, and fulfillment to enter into people's lives.
Wow. That is fantastic. The story turning into what you learned from it, right? So people are probably listening to this saying that I'm going through my rock bottom right now. Yeah. What is the first step that they should do with regards to that? How should they take that?
So if you're actually actively in rock bottom, right, that's a different lens, I think, than others. Because I think the first thing you really need to understand is like, where are you at? Why are you there? And then what can you do from a future focused and objective perspective to pull yourself out? Like that is honestly like probably some of the most simplistic thing. But if we look at this through the lens of pain, right? Because when we're in a rock bottom moment, we're in pain, period. Right? The world tells us to reduce, eliminate, or avoid pain. That's the narrative. And like we're literally from an evolutionary perspective hardwired to want to avoid pain to survive.
Yes.
But now that a lot of those immediate threats that used to exist to our life from like random animals and natural disasters don't impact us in the same way in the modern day, the reality of it is like the need to avoid pain starts to go away. Because see, what I'm trying to encourage people to do is to recognize those rock bottom moments, right, as moments to build upon. Right. I know that the saying is antiquated, but like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but it's also a challenge of perspective. Yes. Because what it's causing you to do is to see your pain through a lens of meaning. And so your rock bottom moment can literally be viewed through that lens of meaning, right? Like, what am I supposed to learn from this? Where am I supposed to grow from this? What and who do I need to be to move through this situation? So that's if we're in the rock bottom moment. But the reality of it is it doesn't matter what we do, right? Let's overly simplify this for just a second, because it's rock bottom, but this concept applies to everything in our life, whether we're rock bottom or just feeling stuck, which sometimes feels like rock bottom, right? And so we can embrace the pain of hitting the gym for 30 minutes a day to avoid the suffering of aches and pains of a sedentary lifestyle. We can embrace the pain of a difficult conversation with a spouse to avoid the suffering of a loveless marriage that's going to end in divorce, or being stuck in a marriage when we really want a divorce. Right? We can embrace the pain of the fits our kids are sure to throw when we ask them to put down their mobile devices at the dinner table, to avoid the suffering of missing years of lost connection and meaningful conversation that we'll never get back. Like we can't recreate that. But as business owners, we can embrace the pain of firing our top salesperson to avoid the suffering of losing all of our other top talent and stagnant growth, because that salesperson was the biggest cancer in our culture. Right? So this concept applies in everything we do in life. And that's where we really have to look at these rock bottom moments, or the moments that feel like they're rock bottom, as moments that shape and build us.
Yes. It's so beautifully said, because it's the pain that if you can embrace it, it makes you do those hard things, right? It allows you to do them. And, there is a distinction that we should be making here. One is that there is pain that you should embrace because it's going to be good for you. But the other is pain and you embrace it because it allows you to be that victim, and it allows you to continue with that. And many people don't feel like giving up that pain because they're like, oh, but this is my identity. If I give up this pain, I'm not who I am anymore. Right?
Yeah. And we do need to separate those. And here's the thing, the second pain that you just talked about, I don't think is actually pain. I think that's suffering, right? Like you're stuck at that point. I think if we look at the definition of pain, pain is short-term, intermittent, a direct cause by something, and alleviated once that direct cause is removed. If somebody's holding on to it and feeling stuck, that's not pain. That doesn't fit the definition because it's longer than short-term, it's not intermittent, and it's still persisting after the direct cause is removed. So that's suffering. Right? And we don't want to admit that suffering exists in our lives, particularly when it's a direct result of our choices. But what you just said is exactly right. so often people feel like they're either not worthy to not live without pain, or they feel like this is what defines them, or they become the victim and they get stuck. Right? You heard me say one of the very first lessons I learned was I learned not to get stuck by what had happened to me, but instead get moved by what I could do with it. One of the best ways to do that is to seek perspective, because perspective and pain both point us at what's important.
Lovely.
Right? So when I'm 7 years old and I'm laying in the ICU bed, feeling sorry for myself, feeling like a victim, like, why me? Why did this happen to me? Right? I remember that at 7. I remember that feeling. And then we have families coming up to us saying, we're so sorry for what happened to you. We're so sorry. Like, what can we do to help? And guess what? We learned that their kid who's in the ICU bed next to me has a terminal illness and doesn't know if they're going to live for another month.
Wow.
Talk about perspective.
Yeah.
I didn't know at that moment whether or not I'd have use of my arm. I didn't even know if it would be successfully reattached. That was too early. But what I knew at that moment was the initial threat to my life was gone, and I would be able to live a happy, healthy, and productive life if I chose to do so from that point forward. They're not sure if their kid's going to live another month. And so if you're choosing to hold on to pain, that's actually suffering. But what I think is phenomenal here is we all must choose our pain, or our suffering is going to choose us.
Yeah. Very, very important, because you can make the pain temporary, or if it chooses you, it's going to just stick around, right? It's going to be like a leech on you.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And that's suffering.
Yeah. And how do you change perspective? Is there a technique that you use to change perspective? Is it something, how would you go about doing something like that?
I think it's honestly just getting out of your own head and your own body, right? I think if we open our eyes and we look at the world around us, I think it's very easy to see that there are often people who have it worse off than we do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But so often we're so blinded by whatever's in front of us, our own pain, our own suffering, that we refuse to see the fact that, you know what, there are others. And oh, by the way, there's others that are way worse off who also have way better attitudes on life. Right. Like, that's just the reality of it. And so seeking perspective requires you to not have the lens on yourself, but have your lens on the world around you. I think that's the most simplistic way to do it. But you can seek it as well, to the point of you can actually take active action to put yourself in scenarios to be around people who are less fortunate. Right. So my wife and I are aligned with a number of organizations with basically the working poor, or individuals who can't afford to pay their rent, their bills on a day-to-day basis. Right. They're literally one paycheck away from absolute destruction. Right. And it's like, when you see that and you see the smiles on their faces and you see like how they enter into the world, and then you realize all the blessings that have entered into ours. Right. I don't care who you are. Right. That individual that's the working poor still has a place to live. There's still people who are living on the streets in the United States, in a lot of first world countries. And then there's a lot of second and third world countries that have absolute poverty and despair and famine. Right. Like, here's the thing, like, to be alive, we are lucky. Right. To be alive, we're lucky. But then if we look at the fact that there are so many, there's 7.2 billion people on this planet. Guess what? Many of us have it pretty good.
Perspective is one aspect, is getting out of your own head, right? The other thing that I keep seeing is people saying that it's me versus the world. It's me versus the world, right? Yeah. And that mentality is going to make you stick to that rock bottom, because like we discussed in the last episode, you're not going to ask for help, and you're just going to feel like, the world is against you.
Yeah. The victim mentality is so crushing, right? And that's just, here's the thing. One of the most powerful lessons my dad ever taught me is that no matter what, never fails, in every single situation, we always have a minimum of 2 choices. Always. Right? They both might be horrible choices, right? So somebody might literally come hold you at gunpoint and tell you to give them your wallet. Well, you have a choice in that moment. You can give them your wallet. Yeah. Or you could potentially get shot. They're both horrible choices. Which one do you want to choose? Okay. Right? In that scenario, you only have 2 choices, but we all, even inaction or the inability to make a choice, is often still a choice. Yeah. Right? And so when I believe, for the most part, that there are a lot of people who are in that victim mentality. There's a lot of people who feel like it's them versus the world. It's a combination of their choices that have led them there. And again, we don't like to admit that, because that suffering is a direct result of our choices. Yes. But it's also a challenge of perspective, because what we have to recognize is, like, we actually do have a lot more control, and we can start to shift from victim mentality to ownership mentality. We really start to realize that we have a lot more influence and control over everything we do than we realize. Yeah. And even those that have it very rough, who've had bad situations in life. I mean, I almost lost my arm again when I was 20. I went 10 months with it hanging by my side because I had a snowboarding injury, right? It was my choice that put me there, right? But I could have been stuck, sorrow, like, oh, this is horrible. Why me again? Like the reality of it is no. Like that was a very painful period of my life. I was at rock bottom again. But I had a choice. I could let this define me, or I could, again, find a way to figure out what to do with it. That's a challenge of perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, God. So a similar thing happened the second time around. Wow. Crazy.
Yeah, I had a snowboarding injury and I had a compound fracture on my arm and went through 7 surgeons over 10 months who wouldn't go into surgery, even though that's what needed to happen. Tried all of these different things. And you know what? I re-experienced a lot of the stuff that I had when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old in a period of 10 months. But now this time without my family there to support me. Now this time without me, like not having all the same resources, the same people in my life. And guess what? I had created a crusty exterior in my life. Right. So I was at a rock bottom moment then, because what I didn't realize is that period in my life before where I didn't want to be defined. I didn't want to be the victim. I didn't want anybody to set boundaries on me based on their own beliefs on what they could do in my situation. Right. I created a narrative that I'm good. I'm strong. I've got everything under control. I don't need help. Now all of a sudden I re-break my arm. What I realized is the power of our narratives, because the world bought into it. Yeah. Nobody was there to help me. And it wasn't because they didn't love me. It wasn't because they didn't care, but they bought into my narrative. They believed that Brian Bogert was good. He was strong. He didn't need any help. He had this under control. Right. And now I'm in one of the most vulnerable periods in my life. And I also didn't have the courage to ask for help. Right. So again, I could have been the victim. Yep. But what I had to take a step back and realize is, look, I could have felt sorry for myself that nobody was there. I could have blamed my friends and family for nobody being there. It wasn't their fault. It was mine. That's an ownership mentality versus a victim mentality. But what that also helped me realize, like that was a learning moment, right? Correct. So the point here wasn't, ownership versus victim, although that was a part of our entire discussion. Like that I knew in that moment was because of the way I created that narrative. It also made me change my perspective to really focus on human connection, right? We can't go this life alone, right? None of us get out of this thing unscathed. And so it's really the people around us that can also help pick us up and give us that perspective when we feel like we're at rock bottom.
Correct. Either continue to live with the suffering or embrace the pain, right? Make that decision that will get you there. Absolutely. And then what is the next step after that? What happens after that?
Yeah. So, I look at kind of 3 steps when I talk about this, and we didn't talk about this necessarily. So I'm going to take a step back, because I think when people are like, how do I apply this philosophy of embracing the pain in my life? There's 3, and I'll unpack them real quick, because I think it's important for us to understand them. And you're going to really like the last one. I have a feeling you're going to love the last one. You'll see why in a minute. So the first step is we got to acknowledge the suffering we wish to avoid, which sounds a little crazy, right? It's a little backwards from how we most often think. But what that means is, like, we get clear on who we are, what we want to accomplish, the things we want to do, right? So if you and I want to be able to play with our grandkids well into our 60s physically and strong, we've got to do the right things to make sure that we're healthy, strong, physically, mentally, emotionally, to be able to do that well into our 60s, right? And if we don't fulfill that, that'd be a source of suffering for us. Correct. Right. Now, I'm not saying that means that every grandparent needs to be able to do that. But if we know at this moment that that's something we want our life to look like, then suffering is anything opposite of that. Yep. So if we start there, that's really, really clear, because then we understand in those rock bottom moments how to start to move through. The second is we have to we have to identify the pains that we tend to avoid and then learn to embrace them. Right. So for me, I have an imbalance in my body. I don't have a latissimus on the left side. I don't have a tricep. My bicep is my gracilis for my leg. I have a curve in my spine because of the imbalance in my muscles. Right? I literally have constant pain in my body and my back as a result of that. And if I'm not careful, it tips into suffering to a point that it becomes debilitating. 15 years ago, I realized that if I kept myself lean, I kept myself strong, I focused on core strength, I kept myself moving and flexibility, right? And did body work on a regular and consistent basis, that I could reduce that from suffering to a manageable pain. Right. And so what did? I went and I started and I joined a gym, because that's what so many people do. Let's go join a gym. We can start working out. We'll do this. It worked really well for a month. And then I started not going. So I had to ask myself the question, is it the pain of working out that I'm avoiding, or is it the anxiety I get in the crowded gym? It was very definitive for me that it was the anxiety I got in the crowded gym. By the way, an emotional trigger. Right. Yes. And so what did? I had to embrace the pain of building out a home gym, finding the space, the time, the energy, the money to be able to do that, so that I could maintain this level of health so that I don't have suffering in my body. Another one, you referenced this example before, because this is another one that I unpacked for somebody recently, right? They literally saw the 500-pound telephone in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started really digging in and understanding, like, do you like to build relationships? Do you have a hard time having conversations? Do you have a hard time pitching your business or your product? Right? Like, what does this look like? And the answer to all those was like, no. Like, I love doing all of that. Okay. So what we got to the root of is it wasn't the 500-pound telephone that was the issue. It wasn't the avoidance of all the behaviors that would take place on that phone call. It was that this person was actually afraid of what it would look like if they were successful. Again, an emotional trigger.
Yeah.
It prevented a behavior and an action. And so we have to really make sure that we remove a lot of those hurdles and the unnecessary pains on our path. Because I'm not sitting here saying we need to embrace pain all the time. Put yourselves in unnecessary amounts of pain. No. I'm saying we need to identify the right pains that are going to get us on our correct path.
Yeah.
And the last step is that we need to learn how to establish as a habit in all areas of our life.
Lovely.
Right?
Yeah.
So the habit coach, I figure, can endorse that one, right? And experts in habit formation say what, right? They say that all new things, there's an upfront energy tax. Even the way that the experts around habits talk about this immediately makes this look like a tax, a cost, an expense. What we need to realize is that this philosophy, lifting ourselves from rock bottom moments, learning to embrace pain to avoid suffering, what that's all about, it's an investment in your future self. Stop viewing it as an expense. Stop viewing it as a cost. View it as an investment. And when you start to do that, what you'll notice, and you believe this, I'm sure, the longer you establish a habit, the less painful it becomes. The more easy it gets. The less you have to think about it. The more it's not even a habit. It's just ingrained in you, who you are. Right? And so I talk about these 3 steps as a very important critical path for people to build on this, because that's how we start to do this.
Superb. It just puts everything in perspective. And in our last podcast, we were having that discussion about, the number of thoughts that are subconscious and we're just aware about 40 of them, of the stimuluses that are going on. And the whole idea behind what I talk about is that imagine if all the unconscious stuff also was slowly turning positive, right? Then you don't have to necessarily worry about it. So you put conscious thought first in making it
that's exactly right.
Subconscious. And that's the whole idea of, what we do on the podcast and what we talk about. And that's exactly this, right? You can choose what your suffering should be. You can choose what your pain should be. But make a choice, right? Like you have been on Zoom calls since 4:30 in the morning, right? And it's 7:30 now where you are. You've chosen, inverted commas, your pain, correct? It's not necessarily suffering yet, but you said that for the billion lives that I want to reach, this is the pain that I need to put myself through.
Yeah.
Correct. And this is you living your philosophy in a certain way.
It is. I mean, who would I be if I didn't embrace my own pains? Right. I mean, I do this in every area of my life, but that's exactly right. At the end of the day, I want to impact 1 billion people, and there's certain actions and behaviors that are going to get me there. And there are moments where I'm tired, I'm fatigued, I don't want to necessarily do it. But the reality of it is the purpose is very, very clear. And when the purpose is very clear, the purpose overtakes the pain. Right. And so I know what I'm doing, and it makes that pain less painful, because the reality of it is like, I get energized when I have conversations like this. You're right. I have been going since 4:30 in the morning. There have been very few breaks in my day. It is what it is. That's how this day shook out. Not every single day is this long. I have many long days. But the reality of it is, it's like, if we are clear on who we are, we're clear on the purpose that we want to do, and we're clear on the actions and behaviors that are going to get us there, and we can embed those in our behaviors on a regular and consistent basis, right? That's where we start to actually be able to live our dreams, right? Consistency is key. Relentless consistency unlocks.
Yeah.
The more we can do this on a regular and consistent basis, the more free we become.
And a lovely question to ask yourself is, what am I willing to give up, right? Because giving up again is pain, right? What am I willing to give up? What am I willing to change? Change, again, for many people is pain. So, you can start looking at this completely differently. You can say that, all right, getting out of rock bottom is not necessarily an easy journey at all. It is a journey through pain, right? And there is going to be pain, but the faster you embrace it, the better, and get out of it, There's so much more that you can do with your life. And like we spoke about in the previous podcast as well, put a little purpose in there. Figure out what it is that you want to do with it. And then you will see yourself completely getting out of this rock bottom much faster than what it is right now.
That's right. I couldn't agree more with what you just said.
Lovely. Brian, thank you so much for sharing the story with us. I absolutely loved it. How can people connect with you? How can people reach out to you and learn more about what you do?
Yeah, brianbogert.com. It's one of the best places to go visit it. I said this on our last version as well. I've got 1 billion people that I want to impact, and I know 99.99999% of those will never pay me $1. So I create a lot of free content. Many of it's housed there. Forbes articles, my series on YouTube, Bogert's Bullets, a lot of the podcasts that we're featured on. And so really, if you just visit there, there's a lot of free stuff. You might not ever need to pay me $1. You might get everything you need from what's just on the site. But the reality of it is let me know if and how I can help, because I just genuinely want to have an impact in people's lives.
Love it. If and how. Superb. Thank you, Brian, so much for joining us on the Habit Coach podcast.
Thank you very much. Grateful for the opportunity.
My pleasure.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to reach out to me, I am Ashdin Doc on Twitter and Instagram. You can find lots more information on my website, awesome180.com, or check out different content on my YouTube channel called AWESOME180. That's Awesome180.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Want to wish you all a happy Diwali. Hope you had a great festive season. It's been a great week in terms of the kinds of guests we've had and the kind of conversations we've had on the network this week. Do definitely check some of these things out. On This Round's on Me with Gauri Devidayal, she had a great conversation with Garima Arora, who's one of the best known chefs in the world. It was just absolutely riveting. Do check that out. On States of Anarchy, Hamsini Hariharan spoke about chronicling India's different wars. Again, really interesting episode. Check that out. Ashdin had a very interesting episode on his show, The Habit Coach. It was called I Don't Feel Like Doing Anything. It's about how to overcome malaise just generally, and I thought really, really interesting stuff. Kumi Vayana was the guest on Cyrus Says on Monday's episode last week, and she's an educator, and my God, it was such a fascinating conversation talking about the way education functions in India and some of the changes she'd like to see. Just really, really interesting stuff. Do give that a listen. On Uncle Please Sit, Anupam Manur was there with Joel and Tushar talking about the Indian economy, part 1 of a 2-part series. Second part will be out this week. You should definitely check that out. Lastly, I want to talk to you all about the Filter Coffee podcast. Karthik Nagarajan, who hosts that show, is on a little bit of a break. He's back with a banger of an episode. It is with Himura Maya, who used to run Landmark Stores, and they talk about the culture of bookstores and quizzing and all kinds of stuff. Really interesting conversation. Do check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे.
Only on the Nankali podcast every Wednesday, सिर्फ IVM podcast app या वेबसाइट पर, या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.